It's my pleasure to, so that the next couple of papers continues, well, the next paper continues our investigation of the history, the continuation of the history of the memory of the Exodus in early Jewish and Christian traditions. It's my pleasure to introduce Joel Allen, who was an assistant professor of religion at Dakota Wesleyan University. There you are. Good. Oh, and his talk is, don't tell me, The Despoliation of Egypt, From Stealing Treasures to Saving Texts. This, no doubt, will tell us about Indiana Jones.
Oh, absolutely. I should have worn my hat. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's an exciting time for me, especially hearing the last few papers. There's some interesting convergences here that one I'll make mention of as I go along. Few passages have evoked such embarrassment, both for Jewish and Christian expositors, as the despoliation of Egypt. The text seems to indicate that the children of Israel knowingly and at God's command absconded with borrowed Egyptian treasures. This claim became rather standard in the many attacks on the moral character of the Bible and its God. Both Jews and Christians found themselves arguing to justify the text along similar lines and against similar opponents. This essay compares two influential textual allegories by which Origen and Augustine sought to heal the text of its apparent impropriety while providing warrant for what they wanted to do anyway, appropriate the best of the classical tradition and baptize it into the realm of the Spirit. The allegory was understood thusly. Just as the children of Israel appropriated the treasures of Egypt ultimately for the construction of the wilderness tabernacle, we are duty-bound to use the best of our heritage in the classical world for spiritual purpose. This interpretive process resulted from and encouraged a relatively humanistic ethos, which copied, studied, and preserved much of the remaining literary output of the Greco-Roman world. As I said, I'll focus on the interpretations of Origen and Augustine, who broadcast this humanistic posture east and west respectively. But we should note that Philo, not surprisingly, is the first to get this allegorical bandwagon rolling, and he and only he bases his interpretation on Genesis 15:14. Well, I won't have time to explore Philo's exegesis closely. Suffice it to say that Philo allegorizes the meta aposkoues poles, aposkoues meaning baggage, as the coursework of the standard encyclical education, the paideia, which provides the necessary provisions of the soul to make its ascent to God. As such, Philo's allegory spiritualizes basic Greek education and encourages Jewish schoolboys of Alexandria to think of their schoolwork as being not a social ladder, but a spiritual one. So with Origen. Our text from Origen comes from chapter 13 of the Philokalia, an anthology of Origen's writings. This is a letter written to a student, Gregory Thaumaturgus, who is also known as Gregory the Wonder Worker, who became a bishop, a famous bishop. Origen begins by encouraging Gregory to apply himself first to Christianity, but also to all other areas of learning, philosophy, geometry, astronomy, music, grammar, rhetoric, which are helpful in interpreting the scriptures. Just as philosophers say that the encyclical courses of the paideia must be completed before one studies philosophy, Origen claims philosophy is required as an introduction to Christianity. Now, if you have the handout, there are brackets in the handout, so I'm not reading over the text, but you can look at the brackets for easy reference to what I'm speaking about. Bracket A in the Origen text. In paragraph 2, Origen introduces his allegory of the plundering of Egypt. What is striking is that while he clearly presents the allegory to provide biblical warrant for his exhortation to study philosophy, among other things, yet the allegory is not explained as an allegory other than to introduce the topic with the common verb for allegory, antiastai, the scriptures in Exodus hint. While his primary point is clearly based on the allegory, the weight of his discussion in this paragraph is on the biblical text itself, the Agadic edition, which we'll come to next, and the dangers associated with the text, which he describes in paragraph 3. This seems to imply that no explanation was necessary and his readers were already familiar with the allegory. Bracket B. The chief point of Origen's allegory depends on an Agadic edition, which was not taken from Philo. While it might seem obvious, the Bible does not state that the plundered Egyptian treasures were used to construct the wilderness tabernacle. We do, however, have a hint of this connection already in Jubilees 48:18, so it's likely we're in good grounds to believe that this is out there already in the interpretive universe, but it's not a common part of the extant interpretive tradition. The notion seems to exist, but not play a central interpretive role in the extant literature until Origen. Here it sits center stage. Just as the Hebrews used the treasures of Egypt to build the place of worship, so we ought to plunder the intellectual wealth of our culture to further biblical and theological knowledge, which is the tabernacle. Origen is not only dependent on the Agadic tradition, but may be passing along elements of that tradition that have been lost, namely the varying qualities of gold taken, which I've underlined there in the handout. Bracket C. Another key element of Origen's interpretation is the necessity of divine wisdom to successfully transform Egyptian treasures for true divine worship. This plays an important role in the allegory. It's easy to misuse Greek philosophy, which he discusses in paragraph 3, but with divine wisdom it can be successfully transformed. The biblical connection he makes is to Exodus 31, 2-6, where Bezalel and Aholiab are given special wisdom from God for the construction of the tabernacle. Just as divine wisdom was given for the construction of the tabernacle, so divine wisdom is necessary to transform Greek learning into that which affords worship to God. Bracket 4. In paragraph 3, partly in the handout, Origen expresses great concern about over-plundering of Egypt, thus the need for divine wisdom. Many others have been overly accommodating, become overly Platonized, and their heresy arises from reckless, prayerless interpretation. Clearly, the Gnostics are in view. Not only only few do this correctly, most people end up building a golden calf instead of a tabernacle out of Egypt's treasures. Origen is anxious to ward off excessive accommodation and only allows for usage of philosophy as an adjunct to theology and for biblical hermeneutics. And you'll notice he gets the Jeroboam mixed up with Hadad there. Bracket E, this is not in the handout. Origen and Philo in comparison. While it's likely that Origen was familiar with the Philo passage, he draws from a different biblical text for different purposes. As we said, Philo's allegory seeks to spiritualize Greek education as the very provisions of the soul needed for its journey home to God. Origen's allegory seeks to give academic substance to theological and biblical inquiry, and thus to craft a Christian faith acceptable to the intellectual non-Christian world. Origen sees encyclical training as a necessity to interpret the scriptures on a literal plane. Philosophy is necessary to ask the right philosophical questions, and prayerful allegorical interpretation provides the right answers. Origen is seeking to provide an intellectually mature biblical and theological education for those under his tutelage. So enough of Origen. Let's go to Augustine. So Augustine in On Christian Doctrine provides biblical justification for his liberal posture toward Greco-Roman culture. This exegesis generally but uniquely follows allegorical lines laid down by Origen, but also in the spirit of Philo and Clement and Justin before him. In 60a, bracket A, we find the notion that the Hebrew people had to choose between taking good and bad treasures. They discriminated against bad Egyptian treasures, idols, for good treasures, gold, silver, and clothing. His emphasis throughout is that the Egyptians had proven that they were unfit for their wealth by making idols. This justifies the despoliation on the literal plane, but also adds to his allegory. In like manner, bad idolatrous thinking must be rejected. None of this is, of course, in the Bible, nor does it appear in rabbinic traditions. Augustine adds this element, or received it from an unknown Agadic tradition, to the story on the literal level to make the argument work better as an allegory. The theologian must pick and choose between good and bad ideas in philosophy. This theme he expands in 60b. To discriminate between false and superstitious fancies and the knowledge apt for use of the truth and precepts dealing with ethics. Now, Origen speaks of the Egyptian treasures as having varying qualities which have either good or bad use. You construct the same Egyptian treasures into a tabernacle or a golden calf. Augustine, contrarily, indicates that the treasures themselves were either good or bad, and discrimination was required on the part of the plunderer, even in Egypt. He speaks of the ideas that are either appropriate to the service of the truth and very useful for moral instruction, as well as various truths about monotheism to be found in their writers, as the good treasures to be taken and the idolatrous ideas to be left behind. So discrimination is required even in Egypt for Augustine. As is often the case, mystical monotheism of Platonism and the ethical ideas or ideals of the Stoics were considered gold worth having. Bracket B. Another interesting element in his hermeneutic is the notion that the Egyptians were lending their treasures unknowingly, that is, without the knowledge of the Israelite plan of escape. Of course, this is the very feature of the story which causes moral difficulty. We just heard on Pompeius Trogus emphasizing that the despoliation took place in secret, which made it all the worse. So Augustine is fine with that. He elevates that concept of the secrecy of these events. Of course, this is the very feature that causes moral difficulty. Augustine is one of the few, if not the only exegete, who allows that the despoliation was indeed carried on in secret, 60a. On a biblical level, the Septuagint translation of Exodus 11:2 adds that the command is to be kept, this is not in the Hebrew, by the way, adds the command that the plan is to be kept secret. The secrecy of the fair has an importance for Origen here, since in the Allegory, Christians must secretly plunder the intellectual riches of the Greco-Roman world, since the philosophers might find out what's going on and realize that their treasures are being transformed for Christian service and shut down avenues of communication. So it's a secretive kind of thing. And the very part of the story that's a moral problem for Augustine becomes a part of his allegory, and he seems comfortable with that factor. And obviously, when the Septuagint was translated, they weren't real concerned about the moral problem either. They actually accentuated the secrecy of the affair by adding crufe to the text. I should comment that when to speak in the ears of the people, tabarna be'ozne ha'am, in the Greek, whenever that's translated by the Septuagint, it in no other place adds crufe. Here's the only time, there are about 10 of them. This is the only time crufe is added to the Septuagint translation. So clearly they're emphasizing the secrecy of the affair in the Septuagint, which becomes a part of the moral problem. And Augustine's not concerned by the moral problem, apparently. So, okay, C. In 60b, we encounter the phrase, "These things they did not make themselves, but they dug them up out of certain, as it were, mines of divine providence, which have been scattered about everywhere." This has absolutely no connection with the biblical text or previous exegesis. And it's a very interesting phrase because it provides a glimpse into Augustine's rationale for his openness to Greco-Roman philosophy. Just as the gold and silver taken from Egypt was originally mined out of God's good earth, so all truth is God's truth and was placed by providence throughout the world to be mined and used well, not like the Egyptians. This may be best understood against the background of the Stoic doctrine of the spermatikos logos, which was known to have played an important role in Justin's belief that Christ is the embodiment of the logos of which every person partakes. Augustine allows here for a common providence of God, whereby divine wisdom can be mined by anyone out of the ground. All treasure is God's treasure, and all truth is God's truth for Augustine. And bracket D. Toward the end of 60b, we read, "As for the clothing which correspond to human institutions, this may be accepted and kept for conversion to Christian purposes." Here, the plundered clothing of Exodus 12 is allegorized to refer to Christian participation in the trade guilds or the collegia of the day with their uniquenesses of dress. The allegory encourages Christian participation in these social and trade guilds, not for their own gain, but for Christian purpose. Augustine justifies this exegetical jump by the fact that certain schools and guilds are known for their distinctive dress, a fact that he notes elsewhere. So, we see here a broadening of the application of the despoliation of motif. Philo's focus is on the soul's ascent to God, nourished by the paideia. Origen's adds philosophy to the mix and moves from personal spiritual progress to theological education and informed biblical exegesis. Or Augustine, by focusing on the presence of clothing with the despoliated treasures, emphasizes not only theological inquiry, but also Christian participation in the social collegia of common life. He even mentions philosophy's importance to train the mind to think about ethics. Augustine was after far more than a Christianization of literature. He sought to despoliate even the social institutions of Rome for divine purpose. One very telling difference is evident between Origen and Augustine. For Augustine, there are many examples of Christians who have learned to use pagan learning rightly. He says that in bracket D, an innumerable number of Greek theologians have successfully plundered Egypt. He even mentions Moses. Origen is of the opposite opinion. For him, hardly anyone can navigate this balancing act rightly. It requires divine wisdom like that given for the construction of the tabernacle. Most end up building golden calves with these treasures instead of building tabernacles. This highlights a fundamental distinction between these two interpreters. While it's quite probable that Augustine was influenced by Origen in this passage, his posture is not nearly so negative or anxious about the paideia. Augustine's enthusiasm results from the success of Origen's exegesis and example, perhaps. Augustine begins our passage with the bold claim that not only should classical learning not be feared, did he have Origen in mind, but it should be claimed enthusiastically for Christian purpose. In late antiquity, Christians had become thoroughly immersed in the academy, and Christianity itself came to be seen as a philosophical school of thought. Eusebius goes even further, and claiming that Constantine's Rome itself and all its social institutions had become a divine vehicle to promote the spread of Christian truth and culture. The despoliation of Egypt was the central allegory which opened doors of possibility for full Christian participation in the academic and social life of late antiquity. The paideia of the Christian empire was never eliminated, but only subsumed. Poetry, even Homer, was allegorized, as Stoics had long been doing, and rhetoric was applied to preaching, but they never changed the curriculum. Egypt's treasures were God's treasures, and therefore were ripe for plundering. The importance of this allegory can hardly be overstated. If the church had completely rejected pagan culture in Taliban fashion, most of what we know about the classical world and its literary output would have been lost. Very few texts from the classical world predate the Christian world in terms of transcriptions, in terms of their transcription. Key voices called for accommodation and application in the church. While these interpretations and others may be complex and somewhat contradictory, they did provide a handy justification for those who wanted to enjoy the best of both Christian and classical worlds. While Tertullian protested with his famous sneer, "What is Jerusalem to do with Athens?" he was actually a voice in the wilderness. I think Origen and Augustine would have responded by saying something like, "Quite a lot, actually." But they didn't directly respond, or couldn't have, in terms of Origen's case, because they were too busy plundering Egypt. This allegory was constantly called upon, or regularly at least, called upon to provide the biblical warrant they sought. Most Christians viewed the classical tradition as a problematic yet necessary preparation for the gospel on equal grounds with the Hebrew Bible itself. The allegory of the plundering of Egypt was the key biblical warrant for this view. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Open the floor for questions. Any proponents of Tertullian here? To hell with the classics. Well, this is a very rich overview, and again, we see how the mobilization of the Exodus memory has fantastic consequences. It's just mind-boggling how much of everything is connected. Right. Everything connects. Great. Well, thank you so much. Oh, good.
I'll ask a question. I was recently in Egypt, and I heard that the Coptic Church was continuing to anathematize.
Garrett, tell your name.
Garrett Galvin.
Oh, sure.
So I was recently in Egypt, and I heard that the church was continuing to anathematize Origen and wanted to do, and this was still very important for them. And as we know, Origen is much more problematic in Christian tradition.
Absolutely, yeah.
So why is that, as opposed to Augustine, whereas Origen actually seems to be a little more kind of, traditional in some respects?
To be frank, I don't know the history on the anathematization of Origen very thoroughly. I do know that it has been more of an issue in the eastern part of the church than the west. The Eastern Church accepts Augustine because he predates the Great Schism. So if a person from the East wanted to plunder Egypt, you could go to Augustine rather than to Origen. And it is the case that the Cappadocian Fathers liked Origen. They included him in the Philokalia, or they summarized his work in the Philokalia, and everybody loves the Cappadocian Fathers in the East. They're great, they're like pillars of the Eastern Church. So the Cappadocian Fathers, you could at least argue that they liked Origen, so you ought to give them a fair shake. But I don't know the history on that.
Scott Nagel. I'm wondering, the emphasis on plundering, it's such a violent verb.
Right.
And I'm wondering, in the Hebrew text, it says that Moses and the Israelites asked Sha'al for these things. It's very passive, really, not very violent at all. And I'm wondering where this exegetical line originates.
Well, it could be that it comes from reading the text with a little bit more skeptical eye. You do have the Kruphe there in the Septuagint reading, which kind of emphasizes the secretiveness of the affair. I think from the Septuagint perspective, there's a little bit of Schadenfreude there. They're enjoying the story, and they want to make sure that it is secretive as a part of that Schadenfreude. But as to exactly why the story on the biblical level might be read in a more positive regard, the way I think of it is as, when you look at the story in terms of the broader structure, it does seem like there's fraud going on. I mean, because the people are asking, and Moses, when he goes to Pharaoh, it's always like, let me give us a few days off work. We're going to go over there. The assumption is that they're going to return, and never is it really explicit that they're going for good. Now, did Pharaoh? Is the narrative? The implied author of the text assuming that Pharaoh's figuring this out? Maybe so, but in any case, the narrative structure of the story seems to imply that this is a secretive affair. They're just going away for a few days of work, and then they make off with all these treasures. And in the Greco-Roman context, this is particularly striking because in Roman law, when you manumit slaves, they're required to treat you as their father till the day they die. And you are, to think of manumitted slaves robbing the one setting them free, it doesn't play well at all in the Greco-Roman world. So there's a particular harshness to the text as it would be read in that period of time. So,
yeah. It also is plunder. I mean, there's a battle metaphor going on in the Song of the Sea and everything. So you defeat the enemy and you plunder them. This is ironic because it's voluntary plunder. So there's a weird, interesting little twist to it, that they give the stuff away. Okay, we're going to do a little transition here between the memory of the Exodus in Hellenistic Judaism and Islam and early Christianity. We're going to go to the late Bronze Age, which sort of sets the stage for this afternoon's discussion of archaeology and history.